Well, welcome everybody to this. This is the Great Decisions course on space policy. And I am Helen Klein, the course coordinator. I mean, I will say about 6 months ago when I agreed to say I will handle the course on space policy, find somebody to present for us and so on, I thought it would be easy to find somebody. And I looked around at Hope and I looked around at generally in universities in the state of Michigan, and I didn't come up with anything. And it really is a very specialized area here, thinking about almost political science kinds of issues and how they relate to outer space. It's absolutely fascinating. And in the process of searching around, somebody suggested that I contact John Logsdon. And one of the things that really amused me, I mean, I sent him a cold call email, so to speak. And his response back to me was, "I'm your man." And it made me chuckle. And as I looked at his background, I realized, indeed, he is our man. This is a person who is very, very deeply rooted in this whole issue of space policy in the United States. In fact, he's so rooted in it that a while ago when we had to change times for this class, part of it was because he was going to have to go down to see the launch of Artemis 1, which had been the launch date, which had been postponed because of a tropical storm. So he's really a part of the American scene in space policy. He is the founder and the longtime director of the Space Policy Institute at George Washington University, and he's nationally known for his space policy. And he is now a professor emeritus at GWU. His PhD is from New York University. He's the author of many books and many articles and so on to say, and so on. And, you know, again, I'll say, welcome, John. I mean, you are the man for this topic for us. I'm going to be monitoring questions and we'll be asking them at the end. So please send your questions in as you have them while you're watching. And I will now turn it over to John.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to be finally able to do this presentation. I've done a similar presentation, a couple of other Foreign Policy Association venues in the same series of topics. So hopefully third time is the charm. I'll get it right this time around. Who am I? Helen just suggested that. I'm old. Just turned 85, and for 60 of those 85 years, I've been actively studying space policy and space history. So I've seen a lot of stuff go down over those 6 decades. I think I do have a pretty good feeling for the totality of space activity in the world. 38 of those years, I was on the active faculty at GW. And did in 1987 create something called the Space Policy Institute. What is that? It is a graduate teaching, research, and professional and public outreach group, small group based at GW that serves as one of the very few places outside of governments where one can get a degree in space policy, master's degree, where one can interact between students and policymakers. Our location in Washington is a big advantage in that terms, and I would argue we're the leading place in the world for the study of space issues. So I'm proud to have started that now, 35 years ago. Professor Emeritus, what that means is you don't get paid. I still have an office at GW, go in occasionally, but I'm not teaching classes. And in the years since I went on retired status, I've been finally able to do the research and writing I wanted to do. So here are 3 of the books that have come out since 2010. And as you might get the impression, my focus has been presidential decisions that have shaped the US space program. So I'm perfectly willing to talk about any aspect of the presidency and the space program, not so much the Congress, although clearly that's part of the process as well. Helen talked to me about me trying to go down to see the Artemis 1 launch, which didn't happen for a variety of kind of irrelevant reasons. The first launch I ever went to was this one on July the 16th, 1969. That is the launch of Apollo 11, and that's me at the field in front of the press site in the red circle. I had written a PhD dissertation that turned into a book called The Decision to Go to the Moon, and that earned me invitations to view that unforgettable launch. So my real goal is to be at Artemis 3, which is the planned first return to the moon with a woman and a person of color being among the crew. Probably, it's currently scheduled for 2025. I'd bet on 26 or 27 myself, but we'll see. And I hope I'm still around to be able to be in a similar position on that day. Along the way, I've gotten to interact with the leaders of, indeed, the world space programs, but in particular, US space programs, and some of the people you'll recognize here. I'm born and raised in Cincinnati. Here are two other men from Ohio. On your left, John Glenn. On your right, Neil Armstrong. I had the good fortune to know both John and Neil fairly well. And so one of the things about my career is it's not purely academic, and it's given me the opportunity to interact with figures that will go down in human history. So that's where I'm coming from as I begin this discussion. But first, you have a 23-minute video, which I will start now and be back when it's done.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Great Decisions 2022, a 9-lecture masterclass brought to you by the Foreign Policy Association. Topic number 1, changing demographics, gives way to a very different challenge here with topic number 2, outer space. For as long as humans have existed, we've looked to the skies with great wonder and curiosity, marveling at the planets, the stars, the systems above us, always trying to make sense of it, looking for order and looking for patterns. Some civilizations believed that the gods resided in the heavens, and they simply left it at that. But as knowledge began to expand, we began to theorize about our place within the system. It was quite popular to believe that the Earth was the center of the system, with all things, including the planets and the stars, revolving around the Earth. Ptolemy, part of the Renaissance of the 16th century, challenged that. A mathematician, an astronomer, he introduced the idea that perhaps the sun is at the center of our solar system. Interestingly, 18 centuries earlier, a Greek mathematician and astronomer reached the very same conclusion. Now we understand that all life began in outer space with the Big Bang. We begin with a thumbnail sketch of outer space. It is, simply put, the area beyond the Earth. We do not have a consensus over the line that separates airspace from outer space. The most common dividing line is called the Kármán line, which is 62 miles above sea level. We do not know the overall size of outer space, but what we do know is that there is no friction there. 3 main considerations for this foreign policy challenge: the space race, regulating outer space, and private space travel. Once we've completed those, we'll be ready to consider American foreign policy options. Let's start with the space race. 1957 was a shock to the world. Sputnik, a Russian satellite orbiting the Earth. We never
Did I stop that? I hit pause. How do I resume? There.
If you hit pause, the pause button does turn into the play button.
Yeah, well, it is paused. How do I end pause?
If you could, John, go back to the presentation, because right now we see the full screen.
Yep.
And you're going to do from the current slide.
Sorry about this.
No problem. It's in the top left-hand corner, so you're going to resume from the current slide.
Left hand top.
Yep, so you're looking actually.
Share.
Okay, perfect. Yep, you can do that. But, yep, and so in your actual presentation, yep. So if you see where your mouse is, you're going to want to go up to from current slide. It's the button right next to from the
We
beginning.
never saw this coming.
Yeah.
It
Perfect.
immediately put outer space as part of the superpower competition. Everything changed in 1957. The space race was on. The United States created NASA with the sole purpose of exploring outer space and eventually reaching the moon. But in 1961, the Soviets beat us again. A cosmonaut from Russia became the very first human to enter outer space and to return to Earth safely. NASA, of course, continued its pledge to beat the Russians to the moon. John F. Kennedy was there to challenge America as well, to say that we can beat the Russians to the moon, we can win the space race. And we did win that space race. In 1969, an American lands and walks on the moon. Here we have that iconic photo. NASA continued its exploration of outer space with many successes and sadly far too many failures. Here you see the Challenger as it exploded shortly after takeoff. The International Space Station's establishment in the late 1990s was a major step forward, both in scientific progress but also in international cooperation, because both the Russians and the Americans utilized the space station along with a large number of other international scientists. And more recently, we have made it to Mars with the rover, collecting samples so that we can learn more about the red planet. So what's next in this space race? Expeditions to other planets? Settlements on the moon? Maybe interstellar space missions? Or perhaps outer space becoming a militarized battleground? We now consider the regulation of outer space. Prior to the First World War, there were several theories on a nation-state's relationship to the air above it. On one end of the spectrum was that collection of countries that argued, using the old Latin phrase usque ad coelum, that a nation's sovereignty extends into the heavens. There are no limits. The country enjoys ownership over everything above it. On the other end of the spectrum, some countries argued for res communis, or common heritage, meaning that airspace is open to all. It can be explored by any, and no nation state can claim sovereignty over it. The point in between would be a line separating airspace from outer space, with the nation state enjoying sovereignty up until that point. And then above, it would be res communis. The experience in World War I greatly influenced the global consensus on airspace law. The Germans in particular were able to use their air balloons. They did so for purposes of espionage, for the movement of troops, and for the dropping of bombs. And it's also in World War I that we saw military aircraft play a very important role in the outcome of battles. As a result of that experience, shortly thereafter at the Paris Convention, it was determined that each nation state owns the airspace above it. Usque ad coelum became the reigning principle to regulate airspace and outer space. Sovereignty extending into the heavens, permission must be requested and provided before any aircraft can enter into the airspace of another country. Sputnik changed all of that. In the late 1950s, we experienced something called rebus sextentibus, a fundamental change of circumstance that renders existing law irrelevant. When the Soviet Union was able to put a satellite in outer space orbiting the Earth, it shattered the idea that nation states could effectively control airspace into the heavens. Immediately, it was understood we need a line separating airspace, which is the sovereign domain, the territory of the country, from outer space, which is res communis or common heritage. So we then moved from one end of the spectrum to the center. Negotiations were underway to determine exactly where that point would be, that line separating airspace from outer space. What does the new legal regime look like? Well, there is consensus that below this line is the airspace of a nation. It is their sovereignty. Above that line is outer space, common heritage, open to all for exploration, and no one can claim it as their own territory. State sovereignty versus common heritage. The problem is we don't have a consensus on that line. Earlier I mentioned the Kármán line, that's 62 miles. That is rapidly being challenged by mathematicians who argue actually 50 miles makes a lot more sense. And then we have the United States, whose position is it's unnecessary to have a global consensus on the dividing line between airspace and outer space. We don't need to do so, and each nation state can determine, based upon their capabilities, where the line separating air and outer space exists. One of the reasons that the United States does not want a very high divide between common heritage and state sovereignty is that we have advanced military aircraft that can fly very high, but certainly not 50 miles high, in order to spy on other countries. So if the line is low enough that our aircraft can fly above it, we're technically in outer space, common heritage, but we're spying on other countries. This is the Red Bull space jump from a few years ago. He leaps from 96,000 feet. It certainly looks like outer space, and it was billed as a space jump. But as you can see, that's only 18 miles up. For most of the world, between 50 and 62 miles is where outer space begins. Codification of the legal regime. Now, legal regime means a collection of international agreements relating to a particular topic. In this case, it's outer space. It doesn't mean that the treaty has to be exclusively about outer space, but rather it has an important impact on the laws regulating outer space. The very first treaty is the 1963 Limited or Partial Test Ban Treaty, because this treaty during the Kennedy administration made it illegal to test nuclear devices in outer space. Then there was the 1967 Outer Space Treaty, followed by the more specific 1979 Moon Treaty. These three documents make up the corpus, the body of the legal regime on outer space, and what they say collectively is that outer space is common heritage, meaning every nation state can explore it, that when astronauts go up, they are envoys of humanity, that states are responsible for whatever they put in outer space, and that no military use of outer space will be permitted. These are the countries that have signed and or ratified the Outer Space Treaty. Those in green have ratified. Those in yellow, Horn of Africa, a few countries in South America, Middle East, they have signed but they have not ratified. And then those in red have neither signed nor considered ratification. As you can see, this is considered a universal treaty, and all of the space nations are represented in the register. In the 1980s, there was a grave challenge to the basic regime principles of outer space because the United States under the Reagan administration pursued Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or what many of its critics and even proponents referred to as Star Wars. This is the militarization of outer space for defensive purposes. Let's begin with the logic of Strategic Defense Initiative. If the Soviet Union was to launch an ICBM, nuclear-capable missile, towards the United States, there are 3 stages where we have an opportunity to attack it. There is the initial stage, that is from the blast, the launch, up until roughly the outer edges of airspace. The problem is that Siberia is so far away and it takes so little time for that rocket to reach the limits of airspace, we probably could not bring it down effectively. Add to that the fact that we don't really know where that missile is heading. It could be a test fire. It could be aimed at the ocean. We really don't know that, and if we're going to shoot down every Soviet missile the moment they're launched, that could very quickly lead to a tit for tat and a rapid escalation of conflict. So stage 1, launch to outer space, is out. Stage 3, when the missile returns from outer space and begins its descent, is also highly problematic because of the technology of the 1970s and early 1980s called MIRV, Multiple Independently Targeted Re-Entry Vehicles. What this means is that one ICBM, upon re-entry, could open up and release 4, 5, or perhaps even more independently targeted re-entry vehicles, each one of which is nuclear capable. So suddenly, if that missile reaches the American airspace, it turns into 4 or 5 nuclear bombs almost immediately. Taking all of those out would be a grave challenge. So it really only leaves us with stage 2, which is outer space. As noted earlier, there is no friction. That means objects move in a very clean, straight, consistent line. That means the missile is highly vulnerable to attack if we have defensive capabilities in outer space. Star Wars, or Strategic Defense Initiative, was designed to reside in outer space, to wait for the ICBM to enter outer space, begin its long, flat plane of travel, and then shoot it with a laser, causing it irreparable damage. Or if that technology wasn't ready, simply throw a bunch of rubble in front of it, metal and the like, that the spacecraft would then fly into, causing it great damage. That's the logic of Strategic Defense Initiative. What was Mr. Reagan really after? This is a question we cannot answer all of these decades later. There are a couple of viable possibilities. Maybe he really did want to provide a nuclear umbrella for the United States, to protect us against a Soviet first strike, to protect us against the first strike of any other nuclear nation, or maybe to protect us against an accidental launch. When pressed on the issue by our allies, Mr. Reagan said we'll share it with Western Europe. When pressed further, he argued we might even share it with the rest of the world. Fine. Defensive purposes, that was one option. Other end of the spectrum, and what Moscow feared greatly, was that the United States wanted to deny Russia a second strike capability. The superpowers had pursued a policy called MAD, Mutually Assured Destruction, throughout much of the Cold War. If one superpower strikes the other with nuclear weapons, there is a mutually assured destruction because the other can absorb the attack and then launch a counterattack that's so devastating that neither side would survive. So if our aim with SDI is to deny a second strike, then the real purpose of SDI is to make possible a first strike against the Soviet Union that ends MAD, but it also creates a great deal of instability. Finally, option number 3, maybe SDI was just a bargaining chip. We're going to pursue it, understanding we're going to gain a lot of scientific knowledge, breakthroughs, and insights just from pursuing it. But we'll always have it there to trade off against something large that the Soviet Union has to offer. That theory was tested in 1986 when we have the historic summit in Reykjavik, Iceland. Mr. Reagan on the right, Mr. Gorbachev on the left. They met in Iceland. They talked about nuclear weapons. And very quickly it became clear a lot was on the table. Major issues like an intermediate range nuclear force treaty. This is a treaty that would eliminate an entire class of nuclear weapons that had never been done before. These are the medium range missiles that were in Central Europe. Then there was the historic possibility of the zero out option, where the Americans and the Soviets, at the time with over 98% of all nuclear weapons on the planet, would agree to zero out all nuclear warheads. It became abundantly clear, however, as they left Reykjavik and that historic house, that no deal had been reached. Not on an historic level, not on a major level. However, it did pave the way for the later signing of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Treaty. First time ever, an entire class of nuclear weapons is eliminated. These two world leaders deserved a Nobel Peace Prize for this document. They would not receive it. Strategic Defense Challenges, SDI, was it ever even possible to reach the point of defending our country from outer space? One of the great challenges was the cost of it. Amazingly expensive. Next is the feasibility. Will it even work? The idea of brilliant pebbles, which is basically throwing space trash in the likely path of an ICBM, was developed because we were having real challenges developing the lasers to target and to destroy the ICBMs. The legality certainly was a question because the United States was a party to the Outer Space Treaty. And what we had to say in the 1980s is that for decades we've been misinterpreting the very treaty that we helped draft and we ratified. What the treaty really says is that outer space cannot be used for offensive weaponry. Defensive weaponry, like SDI, we argued, does fit within the regime and the set of laws. And of course, if we're going to militarize outer space, even for defensive purposes, it is very likely to lead to an arms race in outer space. And that is what we see today. Not because of SDI, but just because this is what major powers do. They invest enormously in research. They look to the heavens and they look for opportunity. A Chinese nuclear-capable hypersonic missile was tested in October of 2021, just about a week before this lecture was recorded. This is a game changer. As one American military elite official said, this is our Sputnik era. A low-orbit, maneuverable missile is a nightmare for the United States. We don't have this, and we don't have the ability to defend against this. We're openly admitting that. You see, the difference is that an old ICBM goes up into outer space, it travels very consistently, and then stage 3, it re-enters the atmosphere to search for its target. But the hypersonic flies much lower, Mach 5 speed, and is maneuverable. The Chinese test landed within 24 miles of its target. That's a very dangerous result of a test, because what it means is that the Chinese will need to load that weapon with a nuclear device to ensure that the target is destroyed, even if it lands several dozen miles away. The United States is taking the space race in a different direction with a Space Force, the development of an entirely new branch of the U.S. military devoted to outer space behavior and perhaps outer space as a battleground. Private space travel is our final consideration. It was Mr. Reagan that promoted it, mandating that NASA encourage private space flight and asking it to regulate all space flight. But it's only recently that the multi-billionaires have been able to fulfill their dreams of reaching outer space. First, it was Elon Musk with SpaceX. Then it was Richard Branson with Virgin Galactic. And then more recently, Jeff Bezos has entered the space race as well. Competitions are certainly underway in outer space. Governments are exploring the outer limits. States are rapidly moving in the direction of militarizing outer space, and private companies are commercializing the space above that line. What they'll all contend with is a very crowded field, quite literally. 6,500 plus satellites currently in orbit. That does not count all of the space garbage, the trash, the old satellites that are now defunct and falling towards Earth or burning up in their orbits. It's a bit of a danger zone leaving the airspace of nations. We are now prepared to consider American foreign policy options as they relate to outer space. The trajectory for the United States is clearly linked to the Space Force, which is the world's first and only independent space force. Question is whether or not it will lead to a new space race. The history of arms races tells us it likely will. Let's now consider the options that the United States has in its foreign policy towards outer space. On the one hand, we can look at outer space as the new military battleground. We would continue to pursue the Space Force. We would look into ways to militarize offensively or defensively the outer space region, very likely resulting in a dangerous arms race. On the other side of the coin, we could recommit to the legal regime, the treaties that make up the corpus, and those principles of outer space, pressuring other space nations to do so. We could encourage private enterprise. We could also prepare to limit individuals in their access to space, in their behavior, and in their claims in outer space, keeping in mind that the legal regimes only regulate nation states. They do not regulate individuals acting on their own or businesses that are apart from national governments. So if we are to limit individual activity, we likely have to revisit the legal regime on outer space and adapt it to 21st century realities. It is certainly within the realm of possibility that very soon we will have humans not only visiting the moon, but perhaps living there in very complex communities. While this is a very exciting time in world history, our exploration of outer space is taking on new dimensions and uncovering new realities. The United States government must think very carefully about its policy towards outer space, both relating to state behavior and individual enterprises, because we're looking at a space race that could take on a very dangerous dimension if we do not regulate it early on. Thank you for attending this lecture. Stay engaged and make great decisions.
Okay. I will not comment on that video very much, maybe some comments as I go along, because unfortunately it's full of mistakes. Here are the issues I do intend to discuss: future of human spaceflight, what's going on with the private sector in the commercialization of space. Is there a new space race between the United States and China? Is space becoming a war-fighting domain? And how do we keep space sustainable so that it is available for all to use, preferably for peaceful purposes and for benefit of people here on Earth? So let me go through these one after another and briefly introduce the issues associated with each. The video mentioned the International Space Station, which is first module was launched in 1998. The station has been continuously occupied since 2000, November the 2nd, 2000. So 22 years, there's always been at least 2 people in orbit. And the plan is to have the station operate through 2030. It's now a cooperative project among 16 countries: the United States, Russia, Japan, Japan, Canada, and 12 countries of the European Space Agency. So it's a great success in terms of international diplomacy to bring all these countries together to do collectively a rather difficult thing. It's expensive, $3 billion a year to operate. And it is a fair question whether we get $3 billion worth of benefits out of the station. In the past year now, I guess, there has been a controversy about Russian engagement with the station, with Russia after first the sanctions after the Crimean invasion, and now the sanctions after the Ukrainian invasion, threatening to withdraw from the station partnership, which would present a real difficulty because the station was designed with interdependence between the United States and the Russian elements of the station. It's almost impossible to operate the station successfully if Russia were not there. That threat has diminished in the past few months as some of its primary advocates have been moved aside inside the Russian government. There are currently, how many people, think for yourself, how many people are aboard the space station? And the answer is 7. 3 from the US, 3 from Russia, and 1 from Japan. And that it's been a shifting number of people and composition of the crew over time. The current commander of the station, because it's organized in somewhat a military fashion, is a Russian. And it will rotate among, I believe, the Japanese astronaut, Wakata, is scheduled to be the next commander. People don't pay much attention to the station, but it is really the only place that humans are operating in space, except for China, which I'll talk about in a minute. The focus of public attention has been the program called Artemis. Artemis is the sister of Apollo. That's why it was called Artemis. And its purpose is to return humans to the moon and then eventually send them on a journey to Mars. The first launch in Artemis was November the 16th. Estimated cost of that launch was over $4 billion. Next launch, Artemis 2, scheduled for 2024, will send a crew not to land, but to orbit the moon. And then finally, Artemis 3, whenever, currently scheduled for 2025. It is, but I doubt it will be 2025, is scheduled to land, as I said earlier, a woman and a person of color among the crew members on the surface of the moon. I may be a little off in these dates. Yes, I am. It was December of 1972 that Apollo 17 was the last time that humans visited the moon. That was early to mid-December 1972. So it's been 50 years since there have been human footsteps on the moon. Hopefully will only be a few more years before humans return. We can discuss, if you wish, what they're going to do there. Interesting legal questions like who owns the moon? Is mining the moon legal? Is private ownership of lunar resources possible? A whole set of questions that have to be determined with respect to the moon. I should say that the video talked about the Moon Treaty. No spacefaring country, no country capable of putting humans in space has ratified that treaty. Not the United States, not China, not Russia, not any of the other leading space powers. I would say the provisions of the Moon Treaty basically are irrelevant to the future regime in space, not part of the central corpus of international space law. Then there are private space flights. Been a lot of publicity. Again, the video talked about billionaires at play. Well, they're not playing. They're trying to start businesses. They're trying to invest their resources in creating the capability to carry fair paying humans and other non-human payloads into space. It's not surprising that once they develop that capability, they want to take a ride. And so Bezos and Branson have gone up suborbitally, not yet Elon Musk. He doesn't trust his system enough to take a ride on it yet. The Jeff Bezos's company, Blue Origin, Richard Branson's company, Virgin Galactic, only go to suborbital flights, quick up and right back. Blue Origin goes up 66 miles above the Kármán line. Virgin Galactic only 50 miles, but still claims it's taking people into space. SpaceX is offering private flights into orbit and beyond. There is a wealthy individual named Jared Eisenman who has already bought one 4-person orbital flight and is already under contract for 3 more for $50 million a seat. If you want to go into orbit, you should call Jared. There's a company called Axiom, which wants to build private space stations in orbit. As a first step in that, rented a SpaceX flight and took several people to the space station for a short stay. The idea of after the space station, low Earth orbit will be populated by several private facilities doing a variety of things. I think there's probably not a good future for government astronauts in low Earth orbit. If they're going to go anywhere, it's going into deep space beyond low Earth orbit. I wouldn't be eager to sign up to be a government astronaut. Looking at the future, I'd work with one of these companies or get wealthy myself so I could buy a seat. As I said, Bezos with Blue Origin, Branson with Virgin Galactic are trying to develop a suborbital space tourism business. SpaceX and Elon Musk is trying to develop an orbital private tourism business. Whether there is a market for that or not, I think remains to be determined. The point is that there are lots of other things that are done in orbit and beyond that have the potential of turning into commercial enterprises. Communication certainly is a thriving business. Earth observation is a multi-billion-dollar business. People are talking about removing some of the garbage, the debris in space, servicing satellites to extend their lifetime, manufacturing things in space, mining asteroids. There's been a rapid rise in private investment in space over the past decade. And for example, in 2021, $14.5 billion was invested, a private investment in space, which was a 50% increase over 2020. And there are projections. Space is now a $447 billion is the area of economic activity. Most of that economic activity is paying to use space systems rather than building or operating them. It's the users, communications, TV networks. Most of us are going to watch a US-Iran soccer game this afternoon, which will come via communication satellites paid for by, in the US, the Fox network. Both Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos have very grandiose or grand visions of what will happen in space in the future. Musk wants to send millions of people to Mars and create a large, thriving city on Mars. Bezos wants to move heavy industry into orbiting space stations out in the region around the moon and get pollution off the Earth's surface. Those are long-term visions, but that's the kind of stuff they're trying to do, not playing. One of the innovations that's made this all possible is the fact of reusing at least the first stage of rockets. And so far, only one rocket, the SpaceX Falcon 9, which is this top image, is shown landing on its pad at the Kennedy Space Center. This has been a very disruptive innovation. I mean, some of these first stages have been used more than 10 times, and that lowers the cost of access to space, which makes the cost of doing business significantly lower. On the bottom is, in the middle, the Starship being developed by SpaceX again, which is intended to carry 100 people into space at a time. And it's also being modified, the top part of it, as the lunar lander for the Artemis missions. On the left is the Apollo Saturn V booster. On the right, the space shuttle, just to give you a sense of how large the Starship is. It's in its testing phase, and the first orbital flight is scheduled in the next 6 months or so. Where this all leads is an interesting question. At least one serious financial firm predicts that by 2040, space will be an area of $1 trillion of economic activity. One of the questions is, how do we regulate that? Very little in the current outer space treaties talks about private activity in space. The Outer Space Treaty does say that governments, nation states, are responsible for the actions of all their citizens in space. So technically, the US government has regulatory oversight over all the private activity that's going on in space. But the rules are just being developed. That's a current policy issue, is what rules to regulate various forms of private activity in space. Is there a new space race between the United States and China? It's a question I get asked a lot. My answer is no. Because a race implies a finish line. There was a race to the moon in the 60s, with the United States winning that race by being first to the surface of the moon. What I think is going on between particularly the United States and China is a competition across the board for space leadership in civil, in commercial, and in military uses of space. And I think that competition is likely to be very long lasting. The moon holds a central place in China's spaceflight plans. They've landed a series of robotic spacecraft on the surface of the moon, including on the far side, that brought back lunar samples, and several other robotic missions. They're called Chang'e missions. And just 2 days ago, or 3 days ago, China made public its current human spaceflight plans that for the first time include a short, like a 6-hour stay by taikonauts, Chinese astronauts, on the moon before 2030, with the long-term human presence on the moon by China being 2035, more or less. China has a space station, was completed with its third module at the end of October of this year. And today, a three-person, three-man crew of taikonauts was sent to the Chinese space station to replace the people that are already there. So there's an active Chinese space station that makes 3 Chinese and 7 Western people well, 6 Western and 1 Japanese in orbit. China has invited other countries to participate in its space station program, and that's an area of competition between China with Tiangong, which means Heavenly Palace, and the allied International Space Station. Currently, US law forbids, with a few exceptions, the United States and China cooperating in space missions. This has been a law in place since 2011. And it's clearly very dependent on the state overall of US-Chinese relations. We'll see whether in coming years it makes sense to change that prohibition and work together in space. I mean, again, the example, the US and the Soviet Union were rivals in space for many years. Now Russia is an intimate partner in the International Space Station. China is developing comprehensive military space capabilities. Again, the video was a little misleading because a hypersonic device is not a space weapon. And if you look back at the graphic there, it never goes above the boundary of outer space and it doesn't go into orbit. But China has developed a lot of capabilities to use against other satellites, so-called anti-satellite weapons, and in particular to use against potential US military satellites. I'll talk about that in a moment. But China has tested, first test was 2007, its own anti-satellite capability and continues to develop that. And that's something that is really threatening. All right, space is a war-fighting domain. Again, the words here are important, and they were mixed up in the video. Space has been militarized from the start. There have been military activities in space, just not weapons. Space has been used for communications, for intelligence, Earth observation, for early warning of missile attack, for positioning, navigation, and timing. Galileo, that we all use, GPS and Galileo, which is the European system, which we all use in our navigation systems, is a military system owned and operated now by the Space Force. So space is militarized and will continue to be militarized. The crucial policy issue is, will space be weaponized? Both, I should say, China, Russia, and India, and the United States have all tested but not deployed anti-satellite weapons. Other countries have created space forces. The United States is relatively a late comer. Russia, China, all of China's human spaceflight programs and military programs are under military control. Our Space Force was created because of the thought that we were not giving enough attention to the military uses of space. It was under the auspices of the Air Force, and the claim was that Air Force pilots were thinking about airplanes rather than satellites, that we needed, given the military importance of space, a separate organization which it trains, equips, and operates space systems, but doesn't control them if they were used for warfighting purposes. There's another organization called the U.S. Space Command that is prepared to do that. Will there be an arms race in space? Russia and China had for years proposed a international treaty to prevent an arms race in outer space that has not gotten traction in international discussions. There is a lot of discussion of norms of behavior and ways of providing incentives to deter the actual deployment and use of weapons in the space environment. What the outcome of those discussions will be is a major policy issue. The United States proposed earlier this year a ban on testing the kind of satellite you see here, a so-called kinetic kill. It's a fancy way of saying things that hit something with force to destroy them and create a lot of debris in the process. That initiative has been accepted now by 9 countries and was recently the subject of a vote in the United Nations with the 154 countries voting in favor of sort of a moratorium on testing, and only 8 countries, but including that 8 were Russia and China, voting against the moratorium. What more do I want to say there? No, let's go on to this final topic, space sustainability. There are 15,000 or more objects greater than 10 centimeters, about this long, in space. And the video said that there's no friction in space. It's not correct. The video also talked about things deorbiting, and they deorbit because of the very low amount of friction slows the objects in orbit and makes them fall back to Earth. Things like the space station have to be reboosted every few months in order to stay in orbit because of the very slight but very real friction that slows their orbital speed. Space is getting very crowded. The lower picture is the streaks of light are coming from a SpaceX constellation called Starlink, which is intended to put something like 30,000 small satellites in orbit. Astronomers and others interested in observing the universe are a little worried with these streaks of light coming across their field of view. Again, there's no regulation on whether countries can put these big constellations of small communication satellites. The aim is to bring broadband internet on a global basis or not. There's clear need for knowing what's in space, knowing what those space objects are doing. That's called situational awareness. And then ultimately, some sort of space traffic management. Think about air traffic control and apply the very general model to the space environment. And we need some way of preventing space orbiting objects from banging into each other, collisions or electronic interference. That's what space traffic management is all about. And again, there are a number of international discussions about the need for space traffic management, about who would do it, under what rules. Is it creating a new international organization? Is it adding to the International Civil Aviation Organization a space jurisdiction? Is it just being good citizens and behaving one's self in terms of not launching things that would interfere? There are, I think, a pressing need for new rules to govern space activities. The Outer Space Treaty, again, was signed in 1967, or at least first signatures in 1967, before any of these uses of space were conceived. And there's clearly, I think, a need for new rules for the 21st century to regulate what goes on in the space environment, so it doesn't get so full of debris that you can't use valuable orbits. In this top picture, you'll notice a ring of debris around the Earth. That's the geostationary orbit, 23,000 miles up, where many communication satellites are stationed, because a satellite in that orbit does not appear to move from the Earth's surface. You're all aware of the antennas pointing up and not moving. They're pointing at satellites, communication satellites in geostationary orbit. If that gets cluttered, it's an economically very valuable area of activity. And if debris makes it unusable, that would be an economic loss of high significance. So where is this new regime going to come from? Well, there has been, since the late 50s, the United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space, called COPUOS, United Nations Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. It was under the auspices of COPUOS that the treaties of the late 60s and early 70s were negotiated. And in recent years, COPUOS has seen continuing discussions of rules of behavior, norms, guidelines for space, not treaties. I think the general thought is achieving the consensus required for a treaty is a leap too far, but we can develop kind of agreed upon rules with the hope that people will follow those rules, states and private operators. Problem with COPUOS is that it operates under a consensus rule, so it can't issue anything unless every one of its, I think now 70 some member states agree. So that not only does the United States have a veto, but Colombia or Chad have vetoes on what comes out of COPUOS. Aware of that, the United Kingdom recently took an initiative to go to a different part of the UN where there is majority rule rather than consensus rule, to start a new area of discussion. And it's impossible to give it an acronym. The UK initiative is called an Open-Ended Working Group on Reducing Space Threats Through Norms, Rules, and Principles of Responsible Behavior. That's a real mouthful. But that organization had a first meeting, and I think a second meeting is scheduled soon, and will likely be a major forum for the discussion and eventual negotiation of 21st century norms, rules, and principles of responsible behavior. And again, that's going on in the UN context now. The United States, with its plans to return to the moon and explore beyond the moon, has unilaterally set forth what it calls the Artemis Accords, which are a set of principles for deep space exploration. And it's invited other countries to say, yes, they will agree to this set of principles if they want to participate in the Artemis program. So far, over 20 countries have indicated their agreement with the Artemis Accords. Again, you can Google that phrase, Artemis Accord, and see what's in there. It has to do with some pretty basic common sense things, but also rules for safe zones, for mining, some of the things that will have to happen if the visions of space exploitation that some hold are to be realized. There's lots of international, lots of foreign policy activity in the area of space sustainability. And I think it's the most lively, most interesting, and fundamentally the most important area of space policy that I've talked about in this discussion. I'm going to quit now. I've left enough time, in fact, more than enough time for questions and hopefully useful responses. So thanks for your attention, and let's see what you have to say.
Okay. We do have two questions in the queue here. The first one is from Rob McCaleb. In Lori Graver's book, Escaping Gravity, she argues that NASA did not do enough to incentivize private industry. Do you have a comment on her argument?
Yeah, her name is Garver, not Graver.
Okay. Well, okay. Yeah, it's spelled Graver.
Well, she's a former student. I know her well. And represents a particular point of view that is supportive of commercial activity in space, and believes that traditional NASA, particularly when she was its #2 official during the Obama administration, was too traditional and too skeptical of the value of commercial activity, particularly in human spaceflight. She started what's called the Commercial Crew Program, which is now the way that U.S. and allied astronauts get to the International Space Station. So NASA developed, and particularly NASA human spaceflight, developed a particular culture during the Mercury, Gemini, Apollo space shuttle, now space station era, that is kind of self-centered and believes that only NASA knows how to do human spaceflight. And Lori's argument was and is in that's short-sighted, too traditional, and blocks progress that would arise out of the private sector. She doesn't talk much about the non-human robotic areas of commercial activity, of which there are a number of proposals, but not much in her book called Escaping Gravity.
Okay. A second question. SpaceX will partner with NASA, providing a Starship as a lander mated to Artemis, but the SpaceX Falcon Heavy seems to be direct competition, yeah, with a distinct advantage of reusability. Is the Artemis one and done already obsolete?
It's a tough question. I think my own view is Artemis is not one and done. It could be 4 or 8 and done. I think the SLS, the Space Launch System, which is at the core of the Artemis capability to send humans to the moon and ultimately beyond, none of it is reusable, and it is extremely expensive. The questioner snuck in Falcon Heavy, which is not Starship. If I make that distinction, Falcon Heavy is 3 of the medium lift Falcon 9s strapped together, and it is a powerful, probably currently the most powerful rocket in operation. I wouldn't call SLS in operation after one launch. Starship is something that hasn't flown yet, which is intended to be fully reusable and would be, as I showed in one of the images, bigger than SLS, and much more capable. If it works, it hadn't worked yet. I think that SLS will have a limited lifetime of being the key launch system for Artemis. NASA has already set out the funding for the jargon long lead time items. That is, the things that have to be built way in advance for Artemis 4, 5, 6, and 7, I think. And has already funded Artemis 1 through 3. So I don't see, unless one of the early Artemis missions is a catastrophic failure, the United States backing away from Artemis in the short to medium term. I do see, as Starship demonstrates its capability and ability to operate in a significantly less expensive fashion, that it will assume the central role in almost all aspects of spaceflight, but in particular human spaceflight.
Okay, are there any people out there that want to unmute and have a direct question? Please sort of chime in. I mean, I have one question, and it seems to me that when you have something like space, and we don't live in a world where we have sort of governing bodies running the world. I mean, what is going to make us come to some willingness to agree on how to operate in space? What's going to be the motivating factor? I mean, we don't have anybody sort of whipping us or anything. How do we make that happen?
I think mutual self-interest. I mean, there are lots of things in the world that operate according to rules where there's no central governing body.
Yeah,
International law really is weakly enforced.
that's the problem.
Often followed. So as space activities become important to the major powers, I think they mutually agree to adhere to a set of rules that prevent bad things from happening. A lot of the world operates that way these days, without any central, you say, without any central authority. There is no central authority
No.
in the world. And I don't think we're anywhere near a world government that would create one.
Right.
I have
No,
a question.
Go ahead.
How would you address someone who would say, why are we spending billions and billions of dollars for this when those same dollars could be used for the betterment of the human condition here on Earth?
Yeah, that's the frequently asked and never satisfyingly answered question. At the peak of Apollo, NASA's budget was 4% of the federal budget. It's now 0.4%. So in absolute terms, $25 billion a year is a lot of money. In relative terms, compared to everything else the government does, it's not a lot of money. And I would argue it's an investment both in making the future better and giving a sense of hope, a sense of future possibility. It's something that humans should be doing while they address the problems on Earth. And you're not going to solve the problems on Earth by taking the money away from NASA. I can think of a lot of other places where high levels of resources could be shifted. So the answer to me is we do things in space because we want to. And again, of what goes on in space, only a small portion is exploration. It's going new places, seeing new things, either robotically with our robotic spacecraft or sending humans. I think it's something that the world and this US society can afford to do, even though it doesn't directly solve the problems on Earth.
Well,
And
there are,
let me add one thought. And if you believe in representative democracy, a majority of our representatives continually vote the funds needed to continue the space program. So they at least are convinced of the value of what goes on in space. And again, to use a cliche, no money is spent in space. The money is all spent supporting good jobs on Earth. And there's no place in space where people are getting paid, except I guess the 10 astronauts, and cosmonauts, and taikonauts.
yeah, right.
They don't get paid much.
Well, they get a big thrill though, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Any other questions people want to ask unmuted? Okay, well then it seems like we've come.
We did get one more question that
Oh,
just
great.
through. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, yep.
All right, great. How long can an orbiting satellite support living conditions in space?
Wow.
Well, the International Space Station is an orbiting satellite, and it has supported at least 2 humans for 22 years. So that's kind of an existing proof, and it's supposed to support humans for another 8 years. How you do that, you replenish the oxygen supplies. I think 2 days ago, a supply ship arrived at the station with food, including fresh fruit, vegetables. So you constantly have to resupply satellites if they're going to have humans aboard. We haven't gotten to the point of closed agriculture where you could grow your own crops. I don't know how many of the people here saw the movie The Martian, where Matt Damon lived on potatoes for a significant period of time, but we don't have anything like that yet. So the answer is indefinitely, as long as the spacecraft is getting the supplies needed to support human life.
That brings up a really interesting point. We had a class a while ago, and I wanted to attend it in the worst way, and I didn't. And it was on space elevators. And I'm wondering, do you have any thoughts about using devices like space elevators to be transporting things up and down to these space stations instead of having to use rockets?
Well, picture this in your mind. A space station is in orbit, goes around the Earth once every 90 minutes.
Right.
The elevator is at a fixed location. So having the two meet and transfer material would be very difficult. You'd almost have to put the station in geostationary orbit at 23,000 miles, so it's stationary with respect to the Earth. Space elevator is one of these concepts that's been around more or less forever, which a small group of believers believe is technically feasible and would revolutionize the way we would use space. So there is a it has a different name, but a space elevator society that exists to promote the concept. Technically, and there have been a few tests of some of the elements of the space elevator. what does that mean? I mean, for those that don't know, is the idea of some sort of system that you could go up and down on a fixed system to a particular spot in orbit, but it would rotate at the same speed as the surface of the Earth, not at orbital speed. The other concept discussed for years is capturing solar energy in orbit and beaming it down for energy supply here on Earth to replace fossil fuel and other forms of sources of energy on Earth. That's an idea that's been talked about forever, where there was a small group of advocates continuing to push it. And who knows, in 50, 100, 200 years, maybe it becomes technically doable and economically feasible.
Interesting. That is interesting. Any other questions? Okay, then. Well, John, I really would like to thank you so much for doing this talk. I mean, it scares me to think of all the stuff that's going on up there. And you've certainly brought some sort of structure to the ideas of the things that have to be governed and maintained in order for us, hopefully, to take advantage of space.
Yeah, outer space is an area of already central and increasing importance to life on Earth. And
Yeah.
so keeping it available for use, sustainability, I think is a important challenge for the policy community.
Right. Definitely.
Okay, thank you all for
All right. Thank you.
listening.
All right. Bye.
Bye. On to the soccer game.
Yeah, onto the soccer game via the satellite.
Yep.